Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Niskanen Center's webinar on what's new with carbon border adjustments. I am Shuting Pomerlo, the research manager of climate policy at the Niskanen Center. It's my pleasure to be moderating today's discussion. We have some excellent policy experts today on our panel, and I look forward to a great discussion. Before I introduce our panelists, a quick reminder that the audience can submit questions throughout the webinar by using the chat and Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We have some time reserved in the end to answer the questions. Our panelists today are Aaron Cosby. He's a senior associate of International Institute for Sustainable Development and senior advisor of the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. Aaron is a development economist with 30 years of experience. His work focuses on climate change and energy, trade and investment law and policy, mining, subsidies, and green industrial policy. Katrina Rourke. She's a senior vice president for policy and research at the Climate Leadership Council. Katrina develops the details of the Baker-Schultz carbon dividends proposal, manages the council's research program, and supports its advocacy and outreach activities. Dami Wagenknecht. He's a policy advisor for E3G. Dami works with NGO partners, industrial stakeholders, and policymakers on issues relating to decarbonizing industry. His expertise includes industrial policy, carbon pricing, and carbon leakage protection measures. To briefly set the stage of today's discussion, the topic of carbon border adjustment has been gaining some traction over the last 2 years. The European Union is looking to implement a carbon border adjustment mechanism in several years. Meanwhile, there have been some CBAM proposals in the United States and Canada. Carbon border adjustment is a very important topic as we look to address emissions embedded in international trade. There is a lot to unpack. With that, I'll turn it over to Dami to tell us about the latest developments on CBAM in the EU.
Thanks a lot, and hi everyone. It's great to be here, and thanks for the invitation. As I was introduced, I follow anything industrial decarbonization in an EU context, work very closely on EU ongoing legislative efforts to achieve its emission reductions by 2030, which is where the CBAM was proposed initially. So the Commission last year in July proposed a series of policy measures, including a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which, to put a little bit in context of what the EU has proposed last year, was a very sort of gradual, cautious approach towards slowly implementing a CBAM over the next decade or so. So basically what was proposed was to include 5 sectors from the beginning: electricity, steel, cement, aluminum, and fertilizers, and basically roll out a CBAM over a 10 to 15-year time period. So an initial 3-year sort of transition period, which would only include data gathering and reporting at the border, which would then be followed by the first actual payments at the border for imports, which would be gradually increased over a decade, over a 10-year period, as slowly CBAM phases in and current carbon leakage measures, being free allocation, gets phased out. Next to that, it's a cautious approach for a number of reasons, including its coverage. So only proposed to include direct emissions, not indirect emissions, at least not from the beginning. Only covering imports, so no special provisions for exports or export competitiveness. Also no special provisions for least developing countries, nor any exemptions, etc. So that's a little bit setting the scene of what the European Commission proposed about almost a year ago. I think since then the EU has very much been focused on sort of its domestic, very complex procedures when it comes to debating and then putting in place legislation. So CBAM is done through the sort of ordinary legislative procedure, which means that both the European Parliament as well as the European Council have their first readings and first views on the CBAM proposal. They come up with their own position, which will then be followed by interinstitutional negotiations. So where we are right now is still very much in the middle of that process. Things are going a little bit faster within the European Council than they have been in the European Parliament. So the European Council this year was led, or at the presidency, at the French as their presidency. CBAM has always been sort of the child or the priority of French policymakers. And they've really prioritized trying to get a common vision within the Council around CBAM. And that was actually achieved last month, about 6 weeks ago, where a so-called Council General approach was agreed upon, basically setting out how the Council would like to see the CBAM implemented in the coming years. There's a lot to be said about that agreement. I think very shortly or very briefly, it follows the same lines as the Commission proposal to a large extent, mainly keeping the main features of the Commission proposal, but it leaves open certain very difficult political issues that are to be decided upon by a later stage by a different part of the European Council. So basically, there's not yet a decision on what to do with export competitiveness. There's not yet a decision on how this transition from free allowances to CBAM would occur and in what time frame. And the issue of what to do with the revenues, which is also a very important topic also, is yet to be decided. On the Parliament side, there's a whole different process around various parliamentary committees that are to draft reports and opinions on the CBAM proposal. I think what is important there is that the Environment Committee is in the lead, and they are in sort of the crunch time when it comes to finalizing and voting on their reports. That is scheduled to take place in 2.5 weeks or in 3 weeks, mid-May. So there's very difficult negotiations ongoing right now in trying to get a majority around the proposal that was made by Mohamed Chahim, who is the so-called rapporteur. And after the ENVI vote, there will be a plenary vote before summer recess. That's the plan, at least, which will then be followed by trialogues. So this all sounds very great. There's a lot of, it's a very tight timeline, a lot of things to be decided still. But if all goes well, these sort of interinstitutional negotiations will start after summer. And the very optimistic deadline is an agreement before the end of the year, so the transition period can start next year. I'm very skeptical of that happening. I would like to think, or I would more realistically think, that things would be delayed by half a year or a year or so. But that's where we are, very close to actual political agreements on where the EU CBAM will go.
Thank you, Domi. I'll turn it over to Aaron now to talk about the latest developments in Canada and more about CBAM.
Thanks very much, Xuting, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. So I guess you can put the Canadian timetable about a couple of years behind the European timetable. As in the European Union, the motivation is the fact that we have an underlying carbon price which is increasing, and we're worried about the prospects of leakage under a scenario where we have an increasing carbon price, but some of our trading partners don't. And I'll come back in a moment to talk about one particular key trading partner. But let me describe first what the carbon price looks like and what the developments on border carbon adjustment in Canada look like. So our underlying carbon pricing regime is the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. It consists of two elements. There's a fuel levy, that's a charge on gasoline. It's a charge on any fossil fuels, and the output-based pricing system, which is applied to large final emitters, any emitter in 38 different product categories across 11 different sectors. These are the energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors. The carbon price that's charged both under the fuel levy and the output-based pricing system is currently at $50 a ton Canadian, that's about $40 US, and has a legislated rise up to $170 Canadian a ton. That's $130 US roughly by 2030. So that's pretty ambitious. The output-based pricing system, part of that, the applicability to large final emitters, has what we call output-based allocation. This is similar to free allocation under the EU ETS. It gives credit toward the obligations under the regime, set at about between 80 and 95% of the sectoral average emissions intensity, depending on the sector. So they're not, those large final emitters aren't facing a full carbon price of either $50 or $170 a ton. There is some output-based allocation that mutes that price, but they still do face incentives to improve, because there's, if you beat the sectoral average, you get credits that you can then sell to those installations that don't beat it. Even with that output-based allocation, though, at prices rising up to $170 a ton, there will be a risk of leakage from those high carbon prices. And really, we don't envision keeping output-based allocation at its current levels for the foreseeable future. We have a target of net zero by 2050, and there's no way we can meet that if the entire industrial sector has a muted carbon price. At some point, they have to feel the real carbon price. So we're worried about leakage. As a result, the Canadian government announced consultations on what a border carbon adjustment might look like in Canada, after having in multiple fora announced that they intend to explore border carbon adjustment, most recently in the 2021 fall budget. Those consultations wrapped up in January this year, and now we wait. We don't have at this point any announcement from the federal government what they have found during those consultations, what they will do with the consultations. We expect to get a report with policy options from the bureaucrats involved. The file is being led by Finance Canada in cooperation with Environment and Climate Change Canada and Global Affairs Canada. So we'll wait and see. It's a difficult file. And one of the big challenges in this file for Canada is, let me turn now to our largest trading partner, that's the United States. The United States at present does not have a carbon price, as we know, and so faces difficult prospects in that context for putting in place a border carbon adjustment. That's challenging for Canada in two different ways. First, we don't want to act unilaterally, ignoring the realities in our largest trading partner. 70% of our trade is with the United States. We have integrated sectors like the auto sector, where you see goods pass across the border back and forth up to 6-7 times before the final product is finished. Integrated trade in electricity back and forth across multiple system operators in different parts of the country. The US is a special trading partner. So we don't want to mess up that trading relationship. Neither do we want to provoke a partner that has a reputation for acting with trade remedy outside the law when it feels aggrieved. But the second aspect of our complication is we really have to act. If our carbon price is to go up to $170 a ton Canadian by 2030, and we are to strengthen the stringency of that carbon price by rolling back output-based allocation, a partner such as the United States, we trade very intensively with the United States in all of those covered goods, and we would suffer enormous leakage to US producers if there was no border carbon adjustment or some other solution. So we may have to act unilaterally. That's a problem. We come back to the fact that that's a serious problem. Unless we can work out some cooperative arrangement with the United States that looks at how we deal cooperatively with the risks of carbon leakage and protecting competitiveness. But I look forward to, that's a nice segue to Katrina. So I look forward to the rest of our discussion.
Yeah, let's turn it over to Katrina now to talk about what's the latest in the United States.
Thanks, Xuting. And Aaron, yes, very many issues to disentangle in the discussion maybe. But let me set the stage, because the US is also talking about a border carbon adjustment, or maybe I'll choose a really broad vocabulary here, which is measures that address climate and trade simultaneously. So maybe not a formal border carbon adjustment. And the US entry point to this conversation is substantively different than the entry point for the EU and for Canada, which is, I think, what makes it so interesting. So we've heard from Domine and from Aaron that the CBAM choices are motivated by a desire to forestall potential carbon leakage associated with increasing stringency in climate programs domestically. And this is the traditional entry point for a border adjustment related to climate change, forestalling leakage, preventing investments from moving overseas to avoid climate action. The entry point for the United States conversation is somewhat different. It sees potential, policymakers in the US see potential for climate and trade measures to work hand in hand as an offensive instrument, not just to forestall concerns about leakage from high efficiency industries in the United States overseas, but also to address global emissions in a new way. We know that the COP process has solicited a whole lot of commitments towards decarbonization, but has no teeth. Trade measures have teeth. Trade measures are legally enforceable, and they can ensure that we can take action on climate change in a multilateral way, which is quite different from what the COP process offers. So another thing to disentangle maybe in the discussion. But one of the sort of primary motivating factors for this interest in climate and trade tools in the United States is this new, well, not new, but existing phenomenon that we're seeing in new data coming out, which is articulating a US carbon advantage, which means the US is a more carbon efficient manufacturer across economic sectors than very many of its trading partners. This is an existing potential competitive advantage that we cannot realize. And in fact, the rules of global trade offer an incentive to sort of the least common denominator. They are more friendly to lower cost, high carbon producers than to producers that undertake the investments necessary to decarbonize and incur costs associated with it. So think of border measures being able to capture this existing competitive advantage that the US has based on its carbon efficiency. And it's no small potatoes. The global economy is 80% more carbon intensive than the US economy. China, India, Russia take 3 to 4 times the amount of emissions to create the very same dollar of value. The existing rules of global trade cannot address those emissions. And what's more, 25% of global emissions are embodied in goods that are traded internationally. 25% of global emissions are released during the production of goods that get shipped overseas. The US has a very powerful consumer economy, and climate and trade tools can leverage our consumer economy to encourage decarbonization globally. This is a really interesting prospect for climate and trade policies for things like a CBAM. And we've talked about the European and Canadian and now the US experience, but the UK, Japan, South Korea also contemplating policies at this nexus of climate and trade. So now we're at more than half of the global consumer economy thinking about measures that unite climate ambition with their trade policy. So now we have more than half of the consumer economy potentially deployed towards encouraging global decarbonization. It's a really exciting prospect for the future of both trade and climate ambition. The elephant in the room is obviously that the US does not presently have a carbon price. That doesn't mean that we don't have climate policies, but there's not a federal carbon price to translate into a CBAM or some similar policy in the United States. And without a doubt, that is the easiest way to build a border carbon adjustment, is to have a domestic price that we can just apply to imported goods. But that we can access 25% of global emissions with climate and trade measures means that we should be having both conversations simultaneously. Both, how do we decarbonize in the US, and how do we leverage trade policy to encourage global decarbonization? I'm pretty excited about this prospect. And it has that, this foundation is climate policy. So let me just take one more minute to talk about the potential climate benefits of addressing climate and trade more broadly. If the US enacted policies that enable all of our imports to match domestic carbon intensity, we could cut US consumption emissions 600 million tons. That's a pretty powerful impact. And if the US joined in some sort of carbon club arrangement, again, your vocabulary choice might be different about what this looks like. But if the US joined with the European Union, with Canada, the UK, Japan, and all of us were able to import goods that match our domestic carbon intensity, we could cut global emissions 1.8 billion tons. That's a 5.5% cut in global emissions. So these are really powerful levers. And I am very encouraged that we're having a conversation in the US that is exploring our ability to think proactively about how to use trade policies to encourage global decarbonization, even as we're trying to sort out what domestic climate policy should look like. Thanks.
Thank you, Katrina. We will have plenty of time to dive into more about climate and trade, and I look forward to that. So our panelists just provided very insightful comments. Now I would like to do a deep dive into some specific policy questions. Before we do that, I would like to remind the audience, please submit your questions in the Q&A function down below the window. We'll try to address them towards the end of the session. Let's turn to Dami first. The European Parliament's lead rapporteur, Mohammed Shaheen, recommended phasing out the ETS free allowances by 2028 instead of 2036, as proposed by the Commission last year. What are your recommendations for EU policymakers on how to handle the free allowances and the proposed CBAM?
Thanks for the question, and always great to kick off with one of the most contentious issues, I guess, in the EU domestic debate. And yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if this is one of the last eggs that will be cracked within the domestic policy debate. It's interesting because, I mean, free allowances is, for many of us working on EU emissions trading and carbon leakage, almost an emotional topic because of a long history with a lot of flaws related to how EU has dealt with free allocation in the past, right? So I feel like there's like two questions embedded within your question. It's like, one is like, how do we deal with free allocation? And the other one is, okay, how do we eventually transition away from free allocation towards a carbon border adjustment mechanism, right? So a lot of the issues around free allowances, or there's a lot of scope still to perfect in a way or improve the rules around free allowances in the interim, right? And that's really what the EU emissions trading system revision is set out to do. There is still a mismatch between how much free allocation installations get and how much they actually need to cover their outputs. There's still, various issues with the benchmark system, which is basically the EU system to assess what the 10% best producers are, which is the level upon which all installations in the sector receive free allocation. So there are a lot of these technical details that need to be fleshed out within the emissions trading system in order to improve, the existing carbon leakage system that the EU has, which is free allocation. I think the big advantage of CBAM, and that's what Aaron alluded to as well, is that it provides us with a tool to eventually fully leave free allocation behind us, hopefully, and finally allow the carbon price to be passed on to consumers and to really be felt by industrial actors within the EU, because without that it will be fairly difficult for EU industry to fully decarbonize and to be on a trajectory towards net zero. I think there needs to be some type of some combination between a cautious approach followed by a very rapid decrease in free allocation. So I'm very much in favor of the sort of transition period that the Commission has proposed, which the European Parliament is proposing to shorten. I'm not in favor of that. I think there are a lot of uncertainties around CBAM, how it will function. Like, I don't think it hurts to have a few years to see how this works in practice and make sure that all the potential gaps are plugged, or all the potential holes are plugged. But I do think after that, if CBAM proves to work, well to protect, especially domestic market from carbon leakage, it is warranted to have a fast or a rapid decrease in free allocation, and provisions to have a full phase out as soon as possible. Obviously, there's a big question mark around exports and export competitiveness, and I know Aaron will definitely have a few things to say about that. So I'll leave that up to him. But I think what Mr. Chaim has proposed is a very ambitious proposal, which probably will not see a majority in the council or within the parliament. I think 2028 is really ambitious. But I do think we will probably end up somewhere between 2036 and 2028. And sort of as a from a perspective of industrials having to make investment decisions this decade in order to really put their production in line with net zero within the EU, and then really make use of the sort of reinvestment cycle that the EU is currently in. I think having a set deadline on when free allocation is fully phased out might be more important than debating on whether that's 2030 or 2031. So yeah, in short, having what Mr. Chaim has put forward is very ambitious, maybe a bit too ambitious to be politically realistic, but I very much admire what he has put on the table.
Thank you, Dami. That was great. Aaron, I know you recently published a paper on the treatment of exports in the EU CBAM. Congratulations. Would you please tell us the key takeaways of your research and your policy recommendations? And more importantly, tell us where we can find that paper.
So I don't know if you should be congratulating me or commiserating that we published a paper dealing with this extremely controversial topic. But I'll get into a little bit about what the final messages of the paper were, our recommendations. To do that, I guess I have to start with the nature of border carbon adjustment. It is not a standalone instrument. It accompanies some underlying carbon pricing regime in the country in which you put it in place. So it's going to look different in different countries. And there are two sort of basic types of border carbon adjustment, one that accompanies a carbon tax and one that accompanies a regulation, something like a emissions trading system or output-based pricing system as we have in Canada. Legally, you have a challenge if you have either of the latter two. If you have a carbon tax, legally, you can charge the tax, probably legally, you can charge the tax at point of import, and you can rebate the carbon cost, the carbon tax, at the point of export, in the same way that many countries, not the US, but many countries do with value-added tax. There's legal provisions for this in the World Trade Organization rules. Not so much so for a regulation. So think about any regulation that imposes a cost on goods coming into the country. We don't allow a rebate of those regulatory costs at the point of export for our goods from any country. That's actually quite forbidden. So that poses a challenge for the European Union, for Canada. If our systems really are deemed legally to be regulatory regimes as opposed to tax regimes, the carbon pricing regime, then we can't rebate the costs of that carbon pricing regime on exports as they go out of the country. Well, in the EU, the carbon sectors, some of them have export shares of over 20%. So we're talking about a huge loss of competitiveness in those sectors, not to mention the sort of knock-on effects in the domestic sectors when you take away the export market and force all that production to be centered on domestic markets. Now, I started out by saying that there was or implying there was legal certainty about the fact that you couldn't rebate exports under the EU scheme. There has been a lot of effort, given the political pressure, there's been a lot of effort to try to find a legal way to do that. And there are several very respected law firms have come up with what they say are legal solutions. It is then more of a gray area than a black and white proposition, although even that's debated. The recommendation in the report that you're referring to, and it's a report from the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition, where I'm a senior fellow, starts from that point. We're not sure it's illegal to export or to rebate at the point of export. There is intense pressure to do it. And in fact, if you don't do it, many would argue that you can't actually put in place a CBAM because it's just politically and economically untenable. So our argument is, look, make it as WTO compliant as you can, and then have the courage to go for it, even in uncertainty. In the worst case scenario, you may be challenged and lose in the WTO. But of course, we've seen those kinds of challenges take many years to resolve in the WTO. The EU-US Airbus dispute took over 15 years to resolve to final solution. And then even if you are found to be in breach of your WTO obligations, it doesn't mean you have to repeal the law. You can suffer the penalties of retaliatory tariffs if you don't want to change the law. In fact, the EU has done this in the context of the US-EU beef hormones dispute. So we figure, take the courage to put in place the most WTO compliant mechanism you can, but do put in place a mechanism to rebate at the point of export. And we do make a recommendation for a specific instrument, the incentive aligned export adjustment certificate. I'd be happy to go into the weedy details if anybody's interested, but I don't know if anybody's actually interested.
Thank you, Aaron. I'll definitely look at that paper and give it a good read. Katrina, I was wondering if you can share some thoughts with us. How would the EU CBAM, how should the US respond to the EU CBAM, and any recommendations you would have for policymakers and businesses in the United States?
Thanks, Chuting. Yes, I, for one, am interested in export policies, Aaron, so we can talk about the details. It's been funny to see that the US has had a relatively muted response to the European proposal on CBAM. Also interesting that in the wake of the CBAM being proposed in the European Union, the US and the EU negotiated the steel and aluminum global arrangement to prioritize lower carbon versions of steel and aluminum as a check on oversupply from high carbon markets, China. So what I'm seeing is that the US doesn't quite know how to respond, but is looking for opportunities to cooperate with like-minded markets so that we can find solutions at this climate and trade nexus that work for both parties. More interesting to me is to see how the US response to CBAM will evolve as the CBAM sort of solidifies on its timeline, and whether the recommendation from Shahim to add some forms of chemicals and polymers will be taken up by the CBAM. At present, the CBAM does not substantially impact bilateral trade between the US and the European Union. The addition of chemicals and polymers would certainly change that. And then we'll see a lot more response on the specifics of how importers to the EU will have to sort of jump through hoops on compliance because it will impact such key exports for the United States. So I stay tuned to see how that conversation evolves in the CBAM itself. But I do see plenty of openings and a real positive signal from this administration and from Congress to try and find additional ways to cooperate through trade measures on climate.
Thank you, Katrina. Now I would like to shift our focus from CBAM a little bit to a topic that's very relevant to carbon border adjustments. We actually have touched upon that just now in Katrina's presentation, and Aaron also mentioned that a little bit. So policies at the intersection of climate and trade have been gaining traction lately. Using trade policies to encourage trade in cleaner goods seems to be a popular idea among policymakers. Aaron, I know you and your colleagues published a book last month on climate and trade. Congratulations again. This book is called Handbook on Trade Policy and Climate Change, and you author a chapter titled Trade and Climate Change, Working Through the Conflicts and Synergies. Could you tell us what's motivating you and your colleagues to write this book and some highlights of your chapter?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I guess we were motivated by the conviction that the trade regime, while it is not a sole source of solutions to climate problems by any means, needs to deeply think about the ways that it can contribute to climate progress and about the ways in which it can reform so as not to block climate progress. I mean, these are two different things. There are ways in which the trade regime can positively contribute to climate change progress. We can think about lowering the tariffs on environmental goods and services. We can think about reforming the rules of subsidies so that fossil fuel subsidies are made illegal. Those are ways in which you find this nice win-win between climate change policy and trade policy. But then there are also ways in which the current regime may block progress on climate change issues. We may have a definition of subsidies within the WTO that does not allow for subsidies to research and development or production of goods that we would like to see more of, like solar panels, like electric vehicles. We may have a definition of subsidies that blocks the ability of the European Union to export or to do rebate exports in the context of the CBAM. Or we may have WTO law which outright says that a CBAM is illegal. That is still a legally gray area. So there are ways in which the WTO needs to be introspective about whether its laws, the skeleton and meat of which was put together in 1947 before anybody thought climate change was a real issue or before anybody thought that there were global environmental issues to be dealt with, is still fit for purpose in 2022. And granted, the interpreters of that law have been good about updating the context in which it's understood, and have even talked about how it applies to climate change. But there may be, it may be time for fundamental rethink. That, however, is a problem. And part of the book also deals with the problem that the WTO as a dynamic forum for revising its rules and negotiations is pretty much a dead item. We haven't seen a lot of progress. So it thinks is one of the topics of the book is also how you can get around that by means of plurilateral agreements, perhaps, or interpretations of existing law. In general, the book, though, takes these two tracks. So, how can you imagine WTO or trade law in general that supports climate change initiatives, and how can you imagine the reform of those laws or reinterpretation of those laws so that it gets out of the way of necessary climate change policies and measures?
Thank you, Aaron. Katrina, I know the Climate Leadership Council launched the Center for Climate and Trade earlier this year. Congrats on this initiative. Could you tell us why CLC decided to launch this center and what you are hoping to achieve through this initiative?
Thanks, Xiuting. Yes, glad to plug the center. We have the privilege of working at the Center for Climate and Trade, which operates as a think tank on these issues inside the Climate Leadership Council, with 3 co-chairs who are just really tremendous thinkers of this climate and trade nexus. Ambassador Charlene Barshevsky, she was the US trade representative under President Clinton, and just happens to be one of the key American architects of bringing China to the World Trade Organization. Jim Connaughton was chair of the Council on Environmental Quality under President George W. Bush, and he has spent a lot of his career thinking about how to use trade to get more, cleaner, American innovative goods out into the global marketplace as a way to encourage both development and global decarbonization. And Jennifer Hillman, a former member of the WTO appellate body, who has done a lot of thinking on CBAM, border carbon adjustment in particular, but also, to Aaron's challenge, how does this political body facilitate decarbonization instead of standing in the way of decarbonization? If the WTO is to be relevant into the future, they have to be a tool for addressing these global challenges and not an obstacle to doing so. So that's our cast of characters. And we're partnering with interests from industry, the environmental community, labor, trade professionals, trying to build the literature necessary to understand the solution set at the climate and trade nexus. I've been working on border carbon adjustments for the last 15 years or so. And while there's a lot of legal gray areas and certainly administrative and methodological hurdles to getting towards implementation, it's an instrument that we understand better every year. There are other options at the climate and trade nexus, and they're not well articulated, and we don't know what the administrative pathways need to be to get there. We don't know how to move within existing trade instruments to activate more towards global decarbonization. And so we want to facilitate this conversation to help us address this carbon loophole, the 25% of global emissions embodied in traded goods, with a sophisticated and diverse solution set, just like we have a diverse and sophisticated solution set for addressing domestic carbon emissions. We need corresponding action at the border as well.
Thank you, Katrina. Now let's turn it over to the audience Q&A session. There are quite a few excellent questions that the audience have submitted. I would like to get to those. But before that, I would like to exercise my moderator privilege. I would like to ask the question myself very quickly. So I'm working on a research paper about emissions embedded in global trade from the perspective of production-based and consumption-based emissions. The paper is expected to be published sometime in May or June this year on the Niskanen Center's website. There's one very interesting research finding. Big polluters like China and the US have a small portion of their production-based emissions embedded in international trade. So for example, in 2018, only 1/5 of China's production-based emissions or for foreign consumption. So in other words, 4/5 of its production-based emissions were for domestic consumption. Addressing emissions in trade is definitely very important, but what about these big polluters' emissions that are not embedded in international trade? How can we effectively incentivize their domestic decarbonization? Erin, Katrina, Dummy, which one of you would like to take this question?
I got some ideas.
Okay.
So I think one of the most powerful elements that we have at the climate and trade nexus is recognizing that the consumer economy can be a tool for decarbonization. The consumer economy can be a tool for encouraging investments in lower carbon pathways. And we can see this on in the policies that are sort of evolving within companies right now, trying to get a firm hold on the emissions associated with their supply chains, right? Very many of the companies that I speak with on a regular basis are trying to get better and more accurate emissions accounting data from their suppliers. And then their suppliers are asking their own suppliers. And now the signal is going out through supply chains. Something like 90% of Fortune 500 companies voluntarily measure and report firm-wide emissions through the greenhouse gas protocol. And in that interest of measuring emissions is this signal that we are sending that a consumer preference for lower carbon pathways is durable. Now, maybe that's not going to manifest as a strong domestic signal in China to address those 4/5 of emissions in the same way, but the signal will be stable, which means there is a perennial incentive to invest in decarbonization because of this opportunity into the future. I'll also note that I am by no means an expert on China and decarbonization, but I have heard in the few conversations that I have had with counterparts that participate in the Chinese market that there is a bit of a tension between companies that want to be able to compete, that want to be able to report their emissions in a better way, that want to be able to access information about the carbon intensity of their own supply chains, and the existing policies in China that inhibit accurate, verifiable emissions reporting. And here we have this opportunity to use a consumer signal to help maybe productively exploit that tension and encourage greater transparency in emissions reporting in the service of global competition, which is a primary motivator for Chinese economic policies more generally. So I see a lot of opportunity once we're activating this consumer choice signal in the international marketplace.
I think that's an excellent point, Katrina. I think incentivizing consumers' choices through the private sector's stable signal will be a good way. Let's turn to Dami quickly. There's a question from the audience for you. The Mohammad Shaheen draft report includes some chemicals and polymers in the products to be covered by CBAM. What do you think are the chances of these goods being included in the final CBAM legislation?
It's a very good question, and I don't have the answer. Like I can give my best estimate, obviously. I think from the Parliament side, there's a lot of appetite to make the product coverage of CBAM a lot, well, initially at least, a lot wider than it was right now. So before the actual policy cycle that we're in right now, there was already an own initiative report from the Parliament, which is basically the Parliament giving its giving its opinion before the Commission came out with its proposal. In there, the Parliament said, look, we would like CBAM to cover all products at risk of carbon leakage, eventually even go down the value chain. What we're seeing right now is a more cautious approach, but there is a very clear willingness to expand the scope, on the one hand, to plastics and hydrogen, so polymers. There's also talk about potentially including refineries as well. I think there's a pretty decent shot that within Parliament, there will be a majority for some of these sectors. I think especially hydrogen is a sector that is getting, if you can call it a sector, it's a sector that is getting increasingly traction to be included, especially around the whole hydrogen hype and potentially importing hydrogen within Europe from neighboring countries. I think when it comes to polymers and plastics and other chemicals, it gets a lot more complex on the one hand, and that is something that member states are very cautious about, but is also changing how CBAM will impact other countries and which countries are potentially to be impacted, right? So if we're talking about plastics and polymers, then the US is a lot more exposed than what it is right now with steel, aluminum, etc., which makes the sort of geopolitical implications of CBAM a lot more complex. I think on the flip side of that, a lot of the chemical industry, think in Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, are quite export intensive as well, meaning that these member states specifically are also very nervous when you start talking about including chemical sector without having a good idea of what you want to do with export competitiveness. So I think from the Parliament side, there is willingness to send a signal that we want to, or they want to expand the scope. I don't see this happening within the initial phase of CBAM, though. I think this will, if it is included in the Parliament position, I don't think it will make its way through the sort of interinstitutional negotiations that will follow later this year.
Thank you, Dami. This next question is from Will McBride. His question is, what are your thoughts on the global carbon price floor proposed and analyzed by the IMF in its current fiscal monitor report, and particularly its claim that this approach is more effective than unilateral carbon border adjustments? He also put in a direct quote from the report by IMF. IMF believes that unilateral border carbon adjustments would be far less effective at scaling up global litigation than a more comprehensive carbon pricing regime. And emissions in traded products are typically well below 10% of countries' total emissions. Anyone would like to answer this question? Aaron, any thoughts?
I always have thoughts, Look, so everybody understands that border carbon adjustment, or CBAM, whatever you want to call it, is a second best instrument. For the first best instrument, or the first best solution, would be if every country in the world had a carbon price, and it should be sort of a similar carbon price, or we can get to the details of that in a minute. Then you don't have any risk of leakage. Then you have, the ability to pursue climate ambition without worrying about leakage and competitiveness impacts. That's clear. And that sort of underlies the IMF assertion that the minimum price, the carbon price floor solution would be a more efficient solution than a unilaterally imposed CBAM or BCA solution. That's true. That's absolutely true. Then my only question is, how feasible is the proposed global harmony hold hands solution? If you look at okay, first of all, the idea that you could get a bunch of countries to sign up to a carbon price floor that was effective and prevented leakage is, if we look at the current diversity in carbon pricing approaches, countries around the world, there's like 60 countries that have carbon pricing with prices that range from less than $1 to like $120 a ton. Right? And it's not just a price that's different. It's what sectors are covered. It's what exemptions and exceptions and offsets are allowed. It's even the basis, right? Is it a hard cap basis or is it emissions intensity basis? There is a lot of difference. So maybe you can get all the countries in the world to agree to come to some kind of a minimum carbon price floor. Maybe you can't. Also inherent in their proposal is the idea that it's not appropriate, and I agree with this, it's not appropriate to ask developing countries to assume the same carbon price as developed countries. You need to respect the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. But it's not clear how you operationalize that, how some countries could, on what basis do you decide exactly what the carbon price floor would be for developing countries? That's not a minor problem. That's a huge problem. And then if you do that, you still have the prospect of leakage. So if the whole point of the thing is to avoid leakage, you haven't succeeded. So for me, yes, it's a great solution. I would love it if we had a common carbon price or even a minimum carbon price agreed among countries. I don't see it happening anytime soon. I certainly don't see it happening soon enough to avoid the need for actions like unilateral actions like CBAM in the European Union or border carbon adjustment in Canada. Because we have, the European Union has a carbon price of over 100 euros a ton. Canada's carbon price is going up to 170 by 2030. We need those solutions to leakage now. And I don't see any negotiated solution like what the IMF has proposed happening in time to prevent those unilateral measures.
Thank you, Aaron.
May I add just one thing? So this is why I get really excited about conversations at the Climate and Trade Nexus, because yes, if we want to effectively address the threat of climate change on a global basis, then a global price floor is a fine solution and will encourage across the board action. Terrific. One of the challenges to getting to a place of equal ambition on climate across markets, with the asterisks about what do you do about least developed countries and poorer economies, is that there is this international perception that climate ambition will be a drag on economic growth and productivity because of the threat of carbon leakage, right? And that's why the European Union and Canada are talking about CBAMs now, wanting to ratchet up climate ambition without losing the economic position of key industries. Climate and trade policies can actually shift incentives completely so that it is in your economic interest to enact ambitious climate policies because it can confer a stronger advantage in your home market and internationally for some of your key industries. An example of this is an analysis that we did at the Climate Leadership Council, modeling the Baker-Schultz carbon dividends plan, a $40 per ton carbon fee, as well as a border adjustment, and looking at the impacts to the domestic steel industry. The consequence of a carbon fee and a border adjustment for the US steel industry is higher sales, higher profits, and lower competition from imports. And that's because the US steel industry is an exceptionally clean producer. So if climate action happens hand in hand with tools at the Climate and Trade Nexus, we can ensure that climate policies are a vehicle for economic and competitiveness success and not a hindrance to them. And so if we want to approach something like a global price floor, a really great way to do that is to show the economic opportunity from climate ambition, so long as you enact these trade policies at the same time.
Thank you, Katrina. Quick time check. We have about 5 minutes left, and I would like to squeeze in one last question. I think this is a great question, and I would like to do a quick lightning round among the three panelists. Domi will go first, Aaron, and then Katrina. So this question is from Sarah Schoenhardt from E&E News. How do you see the EU-US trade relationship playing out, given that the EU seems pretty immovable on its approach to a CBAM? Meaning they wouldn't give exceptions to other trading partners. And where do you see the Carbon Club conversation going at the G7? Tommy?
Sure, thanks. Great question. I mean, Aaron gave his answer in chat, and I think I mainly align with his views there. But yeah, I do think, you know, from a purely domestic approach and what the EU should do around CBAM and acknowledging non-pricing policies, I used to think otherwise, but I'm very much aligned with the fact that it's too much of an administrative mess to try to quantify or assess various regulatory instruments in different countries and try to make exemptions on that basis. So I very much agree with the approach that the Commission is taking and just purely looking at effective carbon prices being paid. I think when it comes to Carbon Club's conversation, there's still a lot of uncertainty on what the German G7 presidency actually wants to do with this. There have been indications in the past that they want to do a whole range of issues ranging from joint carbon pricing or common carbon pricing, both implicit and explicit, working on industrial decarbonization together, having something that is also open towards developing countries, but also aligning views on, for example, trade negotiations at the WTO. All sounds great. It sounds like a very difficult package to negotiate with other countries. I think like over the last few months, that has been narrowed down a little bit towards, and this is talking before the Russian war in Ukraine, which was a lot more emphasis on industrial decarbonization and on cooperation on that, which, from our perspective was sort of the way forward and something that this climate alliance could be potentially helpful for, not something that is focused on carbon pricing and common carbon pricing. But since the Russian invasion, everything seems to have changed. On the one hand, as Aaron says, we're talking about energy security and energy independence even. There's a lot less scope for cooperation within current international fora. But at the other end, we also see that within the German government specifically, this is currently falling, kind of outside of G7 processes and within the Ministry of Finance, which is very much focused on this becoming some kind of joint carbon pricing / let's supply CBAM approach, which I don't see it flying this year. Definitely not.
Thanks, Aaron.
I don't know if you can do this in a lightning response, but I'll try. I'm going to focus just on the Carbon Club's question, right? And the question is, what do we mean by Carbon Clubs, or Climate Alliance, or whatever you want to call it? If what we mean is a common carbon price, then I think I've expressed my pessimism about the possibility that that's going to happen anytime soon. There is, however, a huge, and I'm working on a paper for Agora Industry on this that should be out soon. There's a huge agenda of cooperative measures that would be really useful in the industrial decarbonization space. We should be agreeing on how to measure embedded carbon in traded goods. We should be agreeing on what green hydrogen is and is not. We should be doing joint R&D. We should be creating joint lead markets with similar efforts on government procurement. There is a lot of stuff we can do in this space. We should be helping developed countries come up to speed. We should be agreeing amongst us on what, how to do border carbon adjustment properly. But we should not be implementing a common carbon price, and we should not be implementing a common border carbon adjustment within that club, like a common external tariff in a customs union. That I don't have the reasons to go into that or the time to go into that, but that just doesn't work.
Katrina?
I'm trying to think of what sort of key messages haven't been said yet, and I think I'll just strike an optimistic tone here, which is that these conversations about potential alignment on climate and trade strategy between the US and the European Union can be very productive. A big challenge is to address the consumption emissions in each economy. Both the US and the European Union have consumption emissions about 15% higher than domestic production emissions, and both markets need tools to address those. I see the conversations on this sort of bilateral basis about the CBAM, but also through the G7 and interest in something like a climate club. We can pick the vocabulary when we see where the conversation goes. But these are venues where we can talk about how to productively move together to address our consumption emissions, which is a very significant part of being able to realize anything like deep decarbonization or net zero target. Until we address our consumption emissions, preferably together through trade instruments, it's going to be impossible to meet our decarbonization goals.
Thank you, Katrina. Well, I'm sure we can continue this conversation for another few hours, but unfortunately, we've got to wrap it up. Thank you so much to all the panelists today for the fascinating conversation, and thank you so much to our attendees for tuning in. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. The recording of the webinar will be posted on the Niskanen Center's website in a few days. Thank you and have a wonderful day.